Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Grand Rounds in Population and Public Health Sciences. Today is the last event that we will be sponsoring as part of USC's Earth Month. It used to be Earth Week, but given the magnitude of the threats we face, we decided to make it Earth Month. This is a special event, of course, because on some level, we're going to flash forward to what we could have led off the month, because our special speaker today, Dick Jackson, will be giving us an overall appraisal of what climate change really means to human health, not only here in California, but for the rest of the world. Dick will also be followed by three of our panelists who I'll introduce when they come up after the talk. But we have three great scientists who are working in this area who will reflect on his comments and probably pepper him with a few difficult questions. Hopefully you will have seen the flyer. I'll just give you a very short summary of Dick's credentials. He's a physician, public health specialist, who not only led some of the public health work here in California, but was also for many years the director of the National Center for Environmental Health at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. I spent some time with Dick. We managed to recruit him to the University of Michigan. I was the chair of the Department of Environmental Health then, and Dick joined us as the director of the Graham Institute for Sustainability before he moved on to California, became the chair of the Environmental Health Department here at the UCLA School of Public Health before retiring. But Dick also has been for many years a member of the National Academy of Medicine. He's been leading the National Academy's interest group on climate change, and it pushed for so many different initiatives that are critical to not only reducing our carbon footprint, but dealing with the challenges of now adapting to climate change, a huge challenge for all of us. So without further ado, please welcome Dick Jackson.
Thank you, Howard. You just check the sound. Am I okay? I actually don't say climate change. Back when the Republican administration took over, when I was in Sacramento, they told me that you're not allowed to talk about global warming. And I had to talk about, or climate heating, I had to talk about something much more benign. And warming sounds nice, right? But climate heating is really what's going on. These are the ponderosa pines in the Sierra. Some of them are 1,000 years old, and there was a 20 to 30% death of these trees, some of them 200 to 300 feet tall, and 20 to 30% lost in just one big fire in 2017. So we're really looking at the linkage between human health and the environment that we are living in. 1962, a winter's day, the New York Times magazine had an article that showed a bunch of dead trees, and it was called Silent Spring, and it was a review of a book by naturalist Rachel Carson. Read that book. She was a beautiful writer, explicit, and he understood something that I became passionate. I went to Catholic school and I was told all this stuff about philosophers and theologians and everything else, and realized, in fact, the philosopher I liked best was Henry David Thoreau. He was the one that could really think about the link between our human lives, the natural life around us, and what was the most important. Did a much better job than Plato, in my opinion. Rachel Carson was just decimated. She was up in front of Senate committees, and the pesticide industry showed up and chewed her out. Chamber of Commerce chewed her out. And by the way, if you're really doing good leadership in environmental public health, you better expect you're going to experience a lot more of this. I started a group in the state health department that eventually became the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and doing confrontations with really very deep industries. One of the worst battles right now is Roundup, glyphosate, and carcinogenicity. The other is right now they're doing the CalEnviro screen and using taxes, tax money, capital trade money to really have that money go to the poorest communities. So sometimes you don't know what things will grow into. I remember when this picture was in the photograph, it was actually taken with a Hasselblad camera. So there was no way it could be beamed back from by the astronaut. It had to come down and be developed. But this picture was probably in every dorm room in the United States for quite a while. And the bleak, desolate surface of the moon and this gorgeous blue jewel out in the middle of the most vast blackness and emptiness that anyone, human being, had ever really experienced in their lives. A few miles up the road in 1969, a 900,000 barrel oil leak, much smaller than the big one, the Campeche one down in the Gulf of Mexico, but it outraged people of America because rivers were catching on fire. There were so many issues. I said I grew up in New Jersey. My mother told me as a little boy the stories of women in her neighborhood in East Orange, New Jersey, who were walking around with bandanas like they were bandits. And it was because they had been painting radium dials at the dial plant, the Radium Corporation, and they had their jaws had rotted off. And you can imagine with that how much longer they lived. By the way, when I go back to New Jersey, I've never done this, but you can walk through the cemetery with a Geiger counter, and they will still go off when the remains of these people are 6 feet below. The reality of environment, and the river I lived next to the Passaic River, was the big dumping ground for diamond shamrock for the byproducts of the production of, get this, Agent Orange. So you can't dare eat a fish out of that river even now, 40 years later, from all of that. And the first Earth Day, very interesting because Nixon was in trouble over Vietnam, and we were all used to protesting. You don't know about anybody protesting here, I'm sure. And but Nixon really was not opposed to a lot of these environmental efforts. He saw it as pretty good business, and a lot of his leaders were Republicans, believe it or not, who were conservationists. And you know, they were conservatives. They wanted to conserve, you know, their wealth and power. They also wanted to conserve the natural environment. Everybody alive then, this was the same summer as Woodstock, but everybody alive then watched, glued to the TV all that day as Armstrong exited the LEM module and walked down on the surface of the moon. At that point, the CO2 of our planet was about 320 parts per million. I didn't even know that I should think about that. And I'm a war baby. My younger siblings, my mother remarried after my dad died of polio in 1949. This was a fighter pilot that survived World War II in the South Pacific and died in 2 days at age 27, leaving my mother with 3 babies. And she eventually remarried. I had 4 more siblings. But where I'm going with that is, when I was growing up in the 50s, I thought it was normal. 1 year it was warm, 1 year it was cold, and this was the normal world. Underneath that is the human behavior that what you grow up with, you often think is normal. And when you get older, you realize, oh, my family wasn't normal, my community wasn't normal. All the things I thought were normal weren't normal. Well, let's go forward. These are the hot summers or hot years and cold years on the planet. I did not know that Professor Keeling was measuring CO2 at the top of Mauna Loa, and it was a very good capture of how much CO2 was in the atmosphere. He wasn't doing it in a parking garage in Los Angeles. It was really, you know, what the winds were carrying across the Pacific. And it was going up each day. Here is in 1994, and I'm going to come back to 94 in a minute. It's up to 360 parts per million. And it looked like, for the physicians in the room, it looked like a very high quality oximeter on a patient in the ICU, where the oxygen levels are going up and down with respirations. And in this case, the CO2 is going up and down as well. But if your patient is retaining CO2, and it gets better when you have northern hemispheres, summers when a lot of the CO2 is being pulled out by the vast landmass plantings in the northern hemisphere, it goes down and it goes back up. And here the ocean is trying to capture, and it has captured about 90% of the CO2 put in the atmosphere over time. Oh, to finish the thought, if you're a doctor in the ICU and you ignore a patient that's retaining CO2, you're very quickly going to be guilty of malpractice if you're not paying, unless you've already decided to do a code. I was at CDC in the mid-70s filling my public health service obligation. And I was a board certified pediatrician, and I was assigned to New York State and did an epidemic investigation every week while I was there, including Buffalo with a huge outbreak of hepatitis B, and lots of stuff down in New York. I went there and described the first epidemic of Lyme disease and babesiosis on Long Island. And who thought that, ticks would be in Long Island? Am I okay on sound? I think I may be too close to the speaker. I'm okay, thank you. But when I fell in love with public health, I went to the state health department. When I came back to California, my wife's a Californian, and I love living in the Bay Area. And I wanted to do pesticide work, and I was a big admirer of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy Sr. and the work he was doing with Cesar Chavez and others, and began to work on pesticides and farm worker health. And it was a lesson in just the importance of the heat stress in these workers. I did one investigation actually at the behest of a physician, neonatologist here in Los Angeles, who had seen a baby, was taking care of a baby from the Central Valley who had tetramelia, absence of the arms and legs. And that mother had been, farm worker mother, was harvesting crops during that first, second, and third trimester of pregnancy. She was poisoned once. And when we sent the person that could communicate with her very well, we could not figure out, she could not even know where she was because she was picked up by a labor contractor and hauled out to a field. And when she got sick, the chemicals smelled bad, they burned her skin, but she didn't really know what it was. She was just vomiting and taken to an ER somewhere. But so I was passionate about thinking about moving from, and this is a big theme for me, moving just doing more science to moving to policy. And so I began to agitate with the California Rural Legal Assistance and other groups to put in place a series of laws. I fought 3 rounds. I would go up with all my friends from the Academy of Pediatrics representing the state health department. And then I'd have to get up and say, this health department is neutral on this bill. It's going to fill all the data gaps on pesticides. And my 3 friends would then testify as to why this is unacceptable to be using chemicals that have never been adequately tested. And it led to a whole series of things during the 80s, which eventually led to the only environmental health law, state and federal environmental health law put in place. And this was in 1996 called the Food Quality Protection. And notice it wasn't called the Farm Worker Protection Act or the Environmental Protection Act. It was the Food Quality Protection Act. Because you'll be surprised to know that Americans worry much more, actually, if you're wealthier and comfortable and live in a nice house, worry much more about what you're eating than what those people working in the field in 100-degree temperatures are dealing with. And so we eventually got that law put in place. And I can't remember the exact number. There were about 30,000 chemicals in use. 2/3 of them were removed from the market over the next couple of years because as the data gaps were filled, they turned out to be unacceptable, or the chemical industry didn't want to bother doing the study. I went back to CDC in '94 and met one of the heroes in my life. Here I am being sworn in. Anybody that is sworn in to do government service should never, ever be exempt from being accountable to financial and other kinds of interests. You'll have to think of who that might be. And I have to tell you how much, Dr. Satcher, who became Surgeon General after he was head of CDC, did not know much environmental health, but he did because he was one of 10 children who grew up in Anniston, Alabama. And at age 2, he was one of the younger ones, he developed whooping cough. And his mother, soul of the earth, took her little boy to the hospital there in Anniston, and he was turned away. But they didn't take care of Black children in Anniston, Alabama back then. And so the mother stayed up night and day for the next weeks, keeping him alive. And he's the very first African-American MD, PhD in American history. And so, as I said, he didn't know a lot of environmental, but he did because 1/5 of all the chemical weapons produced by the United States were produced in Anniston, Alabama. And people were given rolls of heavy duty visqueen, they call it, vinyl stuff to tape around your windows in case it was accidental release. And any one of the canisters they had there with the right kind of wind would have killed thousands of people downwind. There was an event where sheep at Dugway proving grounds were killed with a very small release. And for a long time, the government said it was just a virus. When the farmer went out and 5,000 sheep were found dead in the fields. David didn't know much environmental health from a scientific standpoint, but boy, did he understand environmental justice. And I went with him. I said, I was interested, of course, in childhood lead poisoning. We visited homes with children with lead poisoning. And you could see the tooth marks on the windowsill of the toddlers as they were chewing the paint on the windowsill. And we went into one house because I was very interested in starting an asthma program. The NIH, Heart and Lung Institute, was spending about $100 million of research into probably somebody coming to USC to look at the science of respiratory diseases. But in truth, one of the homes we went to was like 4 little kids in on one bed in one bedroom with rats and mice and cockroaches and the ceiling kind of falling down and mold in all of the corners. And Dr. Satcher said to the little boy who's been in the hospital with asthma, he said, well, how do you deal with your asthma? And the little boy went into the room, and he came out with a shoebox. He goes, well, doctor, I take this one out if I'm starting to feel tight and I inhale it. And then if I'm having a lot more trouble, I take this one, probably a steroid, a much stronger one. And then I have to take a powerful, doesn't use the word bronchodilator, that was the next one. And he, as the boy is taking this stuff out, and Dr. Satcher is looking around the room, I could see tears in his eyes, because he knew that our medical interventions, our science interventions were not adequate to help that little boy. And Dave and I spent a week going along the US-Mexico border, visiting people living in refrigerator boxes. And so the issue of justice and met with environmental public health, it is what it's about, and it's inherently political. And you, like Rachel Carson, are going to piss people off when you're talking about this stuff. And by the way, the extraction industry states are much more brutal in terms of their political power than the states that actually rely on people's work. We can come back to that in the Q&A if you want. I was there a few months and at CDC, and we get this call, and you probably had this experience during COVID, but to go to the city morgue, the county morgue, and see freezer trucks next to the morgue, and they're just loading the bodies, the caskets into the freezer trucks. It's pretty unnerving. And the city of Chicago, the city fathers, if you will, were trying to say that this was just a random act, but they had a brutal heat wave, about 5 days over 100 degrees. And the fellow that did this investigation documented over 700 people dying. Guess who died? It was the people who were poor, who were lonely, who did not have economic and social capital, and his connections over, who had their windows shut with about this much open so that they could get some fresh air. They were in blacktop buildings with tiny windows that were perfect for winter in Chicago in the Windy City, but were not going to work well in a tremendous heat wave. And worst of all, many of the people that died, by the way, a lot of these folks do not want to go to cooling centers. I mean, we put cooling centers in place for heat waves. And, I don't want to be there. Can you imagine during COVID, 100 cots in a gymnasium, and I'm going to be there, and there's always 3 or 4 demented people in such places. You just don't want to leave home. Many of the people, of course, put fans in their room. And you put a fan in a 115-degree room, you've now created a convection oven. And so you become very good at baking people. Anyway, it was an unpleasant response, but from the political leaders until they finally accepted. Oh, by the way, the Reagan administration had gotten rid of, about a few years before, getting rid of the Energy Star requirements for air conditioning. What's that about? The Energy Star means you have to have a certain efficiency in the air conditioner. And when you do that, all the companies then have to start producing air conditioners that are much more efficient and the prices come down. So you really can work the marketplace to do the right thing for people rather than inhibit it. I thought our outbreak, this was the first heat wave outbreak, and the head of environmental health for the WHO was a friend of mine, and Xavier Benoit said, Dick, I don't know where you're worried about heat so much because many more people die of cold. I said, Xavier, no, it's, I think we're going to see more and more of this. And a few years later, right there in France, was probably the most shocking heat wave, death from heat waves ever. 30,000 people died. Huge impact on agriculture, on food production, huge costs that came out of it. 6 standard deviations from the mean. And wildfires, energy reduction, and what with alpine glaciers. I put this in, I'm going to tell war story, but where I'm going with this is if you want to create change and you show up with politics, what I'll back up with it. What's the American approach, US government and American approach to disasters, to things that we should be worried about, whether it's pandemics or something else? 2 words. You want to know? Apathy and panic. And we oscillate between apathy and panic all the time. And when the bad things happen, and I've been through this many times, when the bad things happen, you have to be ready for a plan on how to deal with this. Like when the tank car fell into the Sacramento River to kill basically 50 miles of the Sacramento River, fish and wildlife there. You have to have a plan. By the way, you know, the railroads still operate under laws that were put in place under Abraham Lincoln, and they operate with much more independence and unfair autonomy than is, I think, right. And the train that blew up in Palestine, Ohio, had one guy in the front and may or may not have had one guy in the way back, and there was almost no human presence on it because the train industry that didn't want to spend the money on more personnel. So you got to use disasters to really get the. Those are sort of sad stories, but here's a somewhat happy story. During the Olympics and Olympic Games in Atlanta in 1996, Mike Friedman said, you know, it's sort of an interesting study. Everybody's been told, get the hell out of your car. You're only going to get downtown on either the subway or the buses we give you. And the air quality improved dramatically in Atlanta. And the ER visits dropped. And shockingly enough, and I'll tell you, we had 3 kids. We couldn't afford to go to the expensive things. We'd go to ping pong and baseball and the marathon. But people were really friendly. Where am I? This doesn't feel like normal Atlanta. Because when people are in cars, they're not friends. They're competing with everybody else. It brings out the worst in America. It's not the best. I don't need to show these pictures of Los Angeles, but you know, of course, that the reason we have more advanced environmental health laws, particularly air pollution laws, because the whole country was just freaked out by what was going on in Los Angeles in the 50s and 60s. Literally, I'm told this is true, I don't know if it is, that there were kids growing up in LA that did not know it was surrounded by mountains. That oftentimes the smog was so thick. But I want to give a shout out to USC because you've been such important leaders in environmental public health and these respiratory studies. I know this is an old slide. I took it out of the New England Journal when the study was done because I loved it. Because I was constantly being told, wait a minute, you're doing all this stuff, but it really doesn't make any difference. A little smog is going to hurt you. And here are the pulmonary function tests back in 1994 and 1998 of school kids. About 7% of them had, poor pulmonary functions. But I used this study when I was the Secret Service man guarding Governor Schwarzenegger, because he's not a really well-educated. He's very smart and he's very much into health. And I really am showing you. We were doing a lot of work advancing farmers markets. I was a state health officer under Governor Schwarzenegger for a couple of years. Farmers markets and changing food what they called food stamps back then, so you could buy much more fruits and vegetables for less cost during that time. And he was very supportive on that. But then I showed him that first slide, and then I showed him this one. And, you know, he got it right away. You didn't need to be a rocket scientist or an epidemiologist specialist to look at fewer kids have bad lung function, and we improve the air quality, by the way, and it's better for business and tourism and everything else. What's not to like? So thank you, and thank you to Frank Gilliland and many of my colleagues here at USC who I just loved a lot of them. Well, working at CDC in the late 90s was a recipe for depression. And I'm learning more about chemical body burdens and phthalates and endocrine disruptors and, you know, one thing after another. And at some point I was spending too much time thinking about parts per million and parts per billion and not enough about, you know, what really matters in people's lives, what makes them happy, what helps us function. And I happen to be reading this wonderful book by now my friend Whitlow Ravinsky. And he did the profile of the man who was the father of American landscape architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted. And Olmsted struggled with depression. When he got really depressed, he had grown up in Hartford. He'd go over to Europe and tour the parks and green spaces of Europe and began to learn what they were doing about how you view things and sight lines and green space and all the rest. He, of course, was the one that designed Central Park and along with others in Prospect Park, and the big parks in Buffalo, and the Emerald Necklace in Boston. Howard was. But did you know he was also the New York Times correspondent traveling through the pre-Civil War South, reporting on many issues in what turned out to be the future Confederacy, but also on slavery. His argument, he was arguing that slavery is a bad economic decision, not merely an inhumane one. And but he saw something that everybody in public health understood back in 1890, 1900. People that live in bad spaces don't live as long. It led to the whole reform movement, Hull House, and work that Teddy Roosevelt and others did to really get people out, undo the tenements, get people out of bad living situations. Everybody understood living in crowded, dense, dirty housing with inadequate waste removal and drinking water facilities and bad air quality was bad for you. So the American response was, and America always gets things right after they try everything else. The American response was, we're all going to get in cars and drive out to suburbia, and we won't have to worry about where you live anymore. So the abandoning of the understanding that built environment dictates people's health had really abated in the first, if you will, 70, 80 years of the 20th century. They're even CDC, I'm reading his book, and I'm driving to headquarters of CDC. Dr. Thatcher's office was downtown, and we were more remote. And it was a typical lovely Atlanta day. It was about 98 degrees, 98% humidity. I'm on what they call Buford Highway, even though there was Highway 85, 8 lanes wide, about a mile parallel to it. And I'm driving to and this so-called highway was basically a state road that had the homes of the poor on both sides of the street. And, you know, the garden apartments, 2 and 3 stories high. And a mile, 2 miles, sometimes 3 miles between crosswalks. Highest pedestrian death rate in the state of Georgia. Because, you know, you want to get across the street to get your groceries, and you're dragging your little kid along, and the cars are on a 7-lane road, they drive too fast. And they're not going to walk a mile to get to a crosswalk so you can get on a bus to go downtown. They're going to quote unquote jaywalk, which is a pejorative statement in the first place. But I looked over to the right side of the road as I was driving, and I saw a woman struggling, going along with a couple shopping bags, one in each hand. And it was really hot, and she was very uncomfortable. I was late for my meeting. I didn't stop and offer her a ride. I'm in my meeting, and the meeting was on the importance of physical activity in America. It was the Surgeon General's report. CDC writes a lot of the Surgeon General's report. The Surgeon General's report on how we all need to be doing more physical activity. And I'm thinking, this poor woman collapses, the cause of death will be heat stroke, and it won't be absence of public transportation, absence of trees, absence of sidewalk. And if she's killed by a truck going by, and the cause of death will be in the ICU and die there, the cause of death will be motor vehicle trauma, and it won't be absent the most minimal needs for people to lead their lives. And I literally went back that afternoon. I called Howie Frumkin, who had a sabbatical coming up. And by the way, you need to hear Howie's commencement speech. I won't say more than that. I called Howie and I said, Howie, I think we're focused on a lot of things that are too far from where people care about. The polar bears. I do care about the polar bears in the Arctic, but I really care about where people live. A third of Americans don't thrive. Too old, too young, too poor, disabled. They don't thrive. They really think about a disadvantaged population. And we've become so car dependent, we've created a place that doesn't work for people. We have now paved over, thinking about climate change, we have paved over 60,000 square miles of the United States. We've removed photosynthesis from 60,000 square miles, equivalent to the area of the state of Georgia. Over that period of time, and we've taken some of the best farmland in the world and put it under houses. And so what you build really matters, and I'll come back to that in a second. So I was lucky enough, Howie began to write our first book on urban sprawl and public health because I was able to fund his sabbatical. We started to bring in the best and brightest in architecture and engineering and community health and physical activity and water retention and other disciplines. It was a wonderful time. And one of the things I learned from the architects was that 50 years BC, the father of architecture, Vitruvius, had said the three most important things you do when you build is you offer firmitas. You can't build flimsy buildings and put people in them. And so remember all the deaths down in Florida when Hurricane Ian went through? You can't have a building in a hurricane zone where the roof is going to fly off, and you don't want a 40,000-pound roof flying down your street in a hurricane. And we did a lot of work after, and Frumkin was the lead on the one in New Orleans, looking at what are the characteristics of buildings that went through it. Utilitas, they ought to be useful. So putting, there ought to be. I'm sorry, Los Angeles, there should be schools near bus stops. And we're just going to have to positive pressure the air quality in the schools so that people have decent ventilation and then highly filtered ventilation. We did that in the Berkeley School of Public, I didn't do it, but the Berkeley School of Public Health. During the big smoke in Berkeley and Northern California, we told students to come to school because the air quality there was much better than elsewhere. And venustas, lovely word, but beauty. And I think too often we have built without a sense of the beauty of things we build. And where I'm going with that is I have a word that I hate. I was saying to my colleagues earlier. And the word that the real estate people use all the time is amenities. If you buy this house, it has a lot of amenities. It has trees, it has sidewalks, it has a nearby playground, it has decent school, it may even have a community swimming pool and other things. And you should buy because of these amenities. And I'm thinking, these aren't amenities, these are necessities. You want people to be happy and lead decent lives and be physically active, you need necessities. So I'm going to war against amenities. But beauty is, and my friend Bill Sullivan did studies at Cabrini Green and Pruitt-Igoe housing, and the people would, and I'll simplify it, but what they found was they had run out, in one of these places, they had run out of money to do the landscaping. And the non-landscape end of these always had higher rates of crime, police calls, other things than the ones that actually were built with lots of amenities and things that made people happy. We built places like this. I just love this. I couldn't resist it. But imagine you're new here, you don't know anybody, you move into the house on the left, and it's pretty lonely, but 4th of July is coming up, and I want to get to know my neighbors, and I'm talking to the person over the fence, and they say, come on over, we'll have a 4th of July picnic, and I can't really throw the baby over the fence, so, but I'll come over, I'll bring potato salad and some hot dogs, and so I have to go to Google and I look it up, and I discovered that I can drive 65 feet away by getting in my car and polluting the air for 7 miles of driving to go a mere 65 feet. It's not a complete joke, this is a real thing, but where I'm going with this is, and I was on the board of the American Institute of Architects for a couple of years, making, they said, what's the one thing we ought to do, Doc? Do we do everything LEED certified? No. First thing ought to be put people first. Think about people that live there with their children, with their needs and other things. Put people first. You wouldn't do this if you put people first. And I lived in Atlanta, and everybody thought this was the best place to live. Atlanta has 26 times the area for the same population that Barcelona has, and Barcelona has a tenth of the carbon footprint. You kind of know this, and by the way, I'll make the slides available afterwards. You kind of intuitively know this, but if you said the average Atlantan, hey, would you like to live in Barcelona? They'd say, oh, God, no, they'll speak Spanish. But actually, probably speak more English than a lot of Americans do, Barcelona. But where I'm going with that is being in a place with a lively culture, with good food, where you know your neighbors, and can really be well off, really matters. And social capital, when I teach, what's the one thing you learn in business, and you also is you want to accumulate capital, particularly early in your life. Capital is the easiest thing, hardest thing to accumulate, and the easiest thing in scientific study. It's away. And social capital is the same thing. And we destroy the social capital of the Black communities in Bronzeville in Chicago, in Sweet Auburn in Atlanta, in parts of where actually Louis Armstrong lived, in New Orleans, by running highways straight through them. In my video series, we do the same view in Syracuse, New York. The other thing is what you build really matters. My kids were in 3 different schools in Atlanta. My wife had 2 our jobs in different parts of Atlanta. Every day we had the opportunity to argue over who was going to pick up the kids. And where I'm going with that is it was just hard to do simple stuff that my parents thought nothing of when we had local easy schools. And you want to think about crazy urban planning. Think about 2 of the busiest highways in the country, I-75 going this way and I-85 going this way. They do have a circuit route, but its perimeter is not really used. So the trucks, everybody else goes down and hits this giant X. It's like the engineers did a big X crossed over Atlanta. All it takes is a motorcycle wreck and you stop the whole flow of traffic for hours in that city. So it just wasn't working the way we were building. I ended up writing a piece with a lovely colleague, Chris Kaczynski. Chris was a real urban planner. Howie and I were not real urban planners. We certainly weren't real architects. And it was creating a healthy environment. And we were basically, the thing was common sense, about 20 pages, and we published it. And within a week, the director of CDC, Jeff Copeland's office, called me and says, Dick, Congress members have written 23 letters wanting you to be fired. So what did I do? I said, you're condemning the American way of life. And I said, well, it's called the American way of life because you have to be asleep to believe it. No, the American dream, you have to be asleep to believe it. So, well, you know, Dick, where's your sleep? There isn't any science. Nobody's done any work on this in 100 years. And we really need to look at this all over again in the new century. By the way, Chris Kaczynski had brutal cerebral palsy, so he was extraordinarily aware of just how hard it is to be disabled in our country. The first book was Urban Sprawl and Public Health, how he was the lead on that. We did a full issue of the American Journal of Public Health, and we just did an article on it. The one on the top right is my companion book for the PBS series. The bottom right is the derivative of this, because all these issues are much bigger than just urban sprawl. We had to really think about it more broadly. One of the programs within my center was refugee and international help. The term is complex health emergency. Here's the big takeaway. I kind of thought, well, you know, it's on frontier, and we're gonna give people, we're gonna rehydrate them if they've got a diarrheal disease, and we'll give them antibiotics for this or that. But the truth was, the real problems when big populations start to move is civil strife. And I don't know if you've seen the articles about refugees coming across Darien Valley there in the Isthmus of Panama. And young mothers with 2 children carrying some baby formula, a little bit of money, being attacked, having their money stolen, having their 11-year-old daughter raped and a woman raped as they try and move north to find a decent way of life for themselves and their children. This is not unusual. This is what happens when governments fall apart and control falls apart. It is, of all the things I'm worried about with climate change, the thing I'm worried about most is the disorder that will come when vast populations start to move. I'm going to skip this right now. A quick one. The only aircraft in the air on September 11th, private aircraft, non-governmental, if you will, aircraft, was our plane going up from CDC in Atlanta up to New York City after the World Trade Center. And we had about 11 epidemiologists on the plane. I wanted to see them inside, because they banned out to the various emergency rooms that were being served. And the nurses would look at them, what are you doing here? And they'd be just tracking who was sick, how bad it was, what were the outcomes, and what we were really worried about was the second attack, because after terrorist attacks, all the medical personnel and the families, everybody had clustered around where the bomb was going off. That's when the big one goes off. So the secondary attacks, and we were worried about, did those planes have chemical or biological weapons storage in there? And that sounds remote, but within a few weeks, this one happened with NBC and the Senate office building being closed for months because of botulinum toxin being delivered to the senator. I learned a lesson in this, by the way. Benign dictatorship, you've got a smart person running it, is actually much better than having 100 people say, I'm in charge. Old cartoons about the Keystone Cops. Washington, D.C. was a nightmare to deal with because everybody was in charge and nobody was in charge. God help us, there was one person in charge, and I went up there a couple days after this, and they had built out the entire wharf around 85th Street with 200 workstations with computers and telephones and a nerve center to figure out what was going on in New York City. And believe it or not, Rudy Giuliani ran the meetings at 8 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock at night, and was actually a decent leader. So sometimes power corrupts, I'll just leave it there. But you really do want to have people that know what they're doing, taking charge in these events. I also went up to, how am I doing on time? 10 minutes? All right. We had, you would remember this, MTBE and gasoline was an oxygenate that was going to, an ether type thing. It got straight into the groundwater in Santa Monica and many other cities in that state. It tasted terrible. They cost a huge amount of money to do the cleanup. I was told to come up to the White House and brief the Office of Science, Technology, Policy. Bob Watson, who had been at IMF, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, et cetera, said, you know, what you're worried about is small change. Here's what you really ought to be worried about. And he said, look, we're not putting enough heat back into outer space. We're absorbing it all here. So-called greenhouse effect. And this sounds nice if you live in Michigan, a couple of other months of growing season. But other than that, it's not so great, which is why I call it global heating. But, and these are the 3 chemical agents that add to this. I will come back to methane because it's very important, because it has, it is the easiest to reduce, and it is the first big step we ought to be taking to get rid of climate heating. So I'm now the year 2001, September 11th, we're up to 370. And here's the graph up until about last year. Look at the progression of heat. And my oldest granddaughter is almost 9 years old. She has never, every year in her life has been the hottest years on record. Last year, 2023, was the hottest year on record. My sons were born in the early 1980s. they've never lived in a colder than average year baseline. My grandfather talked about walking across the Hudson River from New Jersey to New York back in the year 1900. The winters were much harder. So we've seen huge changes. So big surprise for me, this has happened so much faster than I ever dreamed it was going to happen. Back to panic and neglect. And, we need to do a lot to mitigate. I'll come back to doing this. Heat is energy. And the hotter the water gets, the more energy you put in the atmosphere, and warm air holds a lot more water than cold air. So this is a big change. I think that my great-grandchildren will not see snow on the Sierra because of this heating. Can you think of what a tragedy is? And snow is literally the farmer's friend, they used to call it that, because it slowly seeps moisture in the soil. And for a lot of reasons, it's a much better winter harborage and protects plants much more than this rapid runoff. And if you've ever gone fishing, I haven't really, but gone fishing for trout, they're always looking for deep, cool pools. That's where the fish begin to hide out. I'll skip these two. Anyway, fish migrate to where the water is cold because cold water holds much more oxygen than warm water. So it's easy to say, wow, this is where we are now, this is where we're going. And Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas will have over 50 days a year, over 100 degrees, as will our Central Valley probably has 20 now, but to have 50, and Sacramento is, by 2050, will be as hot as Phoenix is right now. They don't even do outdoor work. Don't give up your occupational health work because we're going to need a lot of help. Did you see that Florida just blocked any laws that would help farm workers and other labor to protect themselves from heat stress? I'm not making this happen on the last week. DeSantis final law saying you can't have a law that protects workers from heat. That's the future. Complicated slide, but all it shows is billion-dollar disasters. And the bright red line is last year, 2023, up. And these are CPI adjusted billion-dollar disasters. And here's what we're looking at. Well, you know, the country's rich, we can handle some billion-dollar disasters. But in my neighborhood, a lot of my neighbors are really upset because their insurance companies are dropping them. And the insurance, who insures the insurance companies? The richest, smartest people in capitalism, the reinsurance companies, Swiss Re and Munich Re and the rest of them. And they're always looking for ways to reduce their exposure to losses. So this is, you know, mitigating all that CO2. Another big lesson. We were in Berkeley when the big fire occurred back in 1991, and I remember the experience with my kids. They were then like 7, 8, and 9 or so. Going out, having to load we had 2 cars, different jobs, load the car up with the family pictures and the things that were really important to us, and driving off because we didn't know we'd lose our home. My wife lost her best friend at work in that fire because she went in the wrong direction from that fire. There were major lessons from this, and I'll just, as a takeaway in terms of beginning to adapt and mitigate. And the fire department goes through Berkeley now all the time to get rid of this, and they're very strict. Fire resistant roofs, up to water storage. I don't know why we didn't have the reservoirs at the top of the hill, because you don't have much electricity to pump water up the hill in the middle of a fire, particularly if the wind is blowing at 90 miles an hour. Undergrounding the utilities. PG&E, which by the way stands for pigs, grafters, and extortions. PG&E resisted terribly undergrounding utilities, and yet if you want to get through one of these things, undergrounded wires and everything else really are the best thing to do. We had no unified incident command in California. So every fire department went out and fought it like a structural fire. That fire probably had 25 local health departments trying to deal with it. And so incident command has completely changed. We fight them like wildfires instead of the others. This is an important one. All that heat, look where it's ended up, in the oceans. So about half of all the sea level rise is now due to hot things expand. So half of it's from melting glaciers and the other half is from this. If someone said to Howard 25 years ago that humanity will have changed the pH of the oceans, you would have said, that's crazy. Well, now the data's done, they're looking down as far as 2,000 meters at the pH of the oceans and measuring the CO2. And you can see that the CO2 content of the oceans have gone up. Of course, the heat's gone up and the pH drops as things become more acidic. You never want to brush your teeth with vinegar, by the way. Acidity dissolves a lot of calcium things, and the bottom of the food chain has to fix a lot of calcium to put the nutritional things at the bottom of the food chain. 2018, look at the snapshot of where it's hot and cold on planet Earth. What do you make of that blue spot? What do you think that is? The one at the top, and sort of in the middle. That's Greenland. Greenland ice sheet has developed these moulins, these canyons that go right down to the water bottom, and it's really lubricating the bottom of the ice sheets to move closer and closer to the ocean. And the water, this is the purest water on the planet, is washing off of Greenland. But when you see the quantity, this is, you can measure the weight of all this stuff from satellites, and it comes out to Greenland's losing 200 gigatons a year, about almost 7,000 gigatons over the last 25 years. So what's a gigaton? I didn't know, I had to look it up. A gigaton is a kilometer, a cube, a kilometer of water, kilometer of water from one in each direction in that cube. And it is 1,000 times 1,000 times 1,000 tons. So it is a billion tons of water in one of these, and it's Greenland's losing 280 of these a year. It's multiple Hudson rivers when you look at that much water pouring on Greenland. And that glacier is important, but it's not as important as this one to humanity. So the Hindu Kush, the Himalayan glaciers directly support the habitation of about 250 million people, and indirectly support the rivers clean 75% of the water in the Indus River. Think about the people that are depending on that. So we're worried about 350,000 refugees. Imagine what 1.6 billion refugees are going to look like. Bad things happen when populations move. I'm going to skip these because I'm running out of time. So what do? One, we've got to build better houses. We've got to adapt. We've got to figure out how to be economic. Two is we got to get rid of explicit support for subsidies for extracting fossil fuels, carbon from the earth. But you also have to adequately charge for the implicit subsidies of not charging for the harms that are being done. And John, you're more, Professor Wolf, you're more experienced in thinking about these economic issues than I am. But we all know that the costs of things dictate what people do, and probably the most effective thing that changed smoking in America was to begin to tax smoking much more effectively. The other big thing we did with smoking was really to focus on the kids and children. And I think that we have done a good job in getting our children the care and a terrible job in terrifying them. And by that, I mean, we have to help our kids have a sense of agency as they think about dealing with these issues and feel power rather than being victims of it. Quick one, but I've probably read 100 environmental impact assessments in my life. They're about 1,000 pages. They get to health, and they have 3 pages. And we need to have proper health impact assessments at the same time. I will defer to Ravna on building areas. I think that bringing joy into people's lives really does matter. I love the leadership that we're getting from young people, particularly in medicine, and I've talked about Academy of Medicine, and here's our work around these issues. I was able to attend yesterday's session. But with this, let's protect all people and let's protect the planet. Hey, this was fun to be with you. Thank you very much.
What a grand tour of what's happening over decades. After all that experience comes in handy. We may have our panelists come up here, John. Eric, just introduce our panelists. We have with us today Bhavna Sharma, who says this is a professor at USC School of Architecture. She's actually co-leading our sustainability and healthcare initiative. She is an expert in life cycle analysis of building materials and has extended that expertise to looking at all aspects of what happens in the hospital industry. John Wilson, of course, is the director of the Special Sciences Institute. He's appointed in more schools at USC than anyone else that I know of, holds the record because of the transdisciplinary research that he does using geospatial skills to give us the data and the linkages we need to do some outstanding research in the environment. And Erica Garcia, this professor here in our department, I'm very proud of her work on the combination of heat and air pollution and its impacts and its differential impacts in our communities, and that relates to inequities. So as we usually do in our panel, we ask each of our panelists to reflect maybe 2 or 3 minutes on what they could talk about from your perspective. And you're also invited to ask a question. We start with Baba.
Thank you, Howard. So what your talk really emphasized is something that we're trying to do here at USC, where we're looking at the concept of resilience and thinking about it from a multi or interdisciplinary perspective, and ways in which to create our built environment with consideration of ecosystem health, but also human health and well-being. The question I'd like to pose is, how can this multifaceted strategy of resilience be a driver in terms of developing policy so that we can start to integrate some of these concepts more rapidly into our built environment?
Maybe it's just me, but my perception is that professors and other similar folks do not listen very well. And when we interact with communities, we're always there to tell them what to do. And we've really got to understand their culture and their knowledge. And can you think about the people that had their neighborhood destroyed by a highway think about the wisdom. And my own experience is you can involve the community. And I was involved with Richmond, California, the poorest city in California. And what happened there was Chevron that was there for the last 100 years, the big economic source for that town. But the community has been subjected to overspills after explosions and other sorts of things on the plant. And thinking about ways we can get the funding, can improve the schools and do other such things in clinics to give people that power, but give them voice. Many times the community does not have the vocabulary to really turn this around. And so by really being in that dialogue, sidebar, I had the nuclear program, health nuclear program under me at CDC. We actually sent for the downwind Native American tribes, we taught them nuclear physics, elementary nuclear physics. You know, what's an isotope? And you get a smart person, they can understand this stuff in a week or two. And you know, the classic thing like, hey, I want to have my potassium iodide protect me from a nuclear blast. And so really having the dialogue where they're learning from us and our vocabulary, but we're also respectfully learning from them is, and by far what I also teach with Julie Gerberding was my boss at CDC and she did something better than anyone, communicated better than anyone I've ever known, which is whenever she used a wonky intellectualized word, she always put the parenthetical next to it so that she would explain what she said, but she kept her expertise, if you will, her status at the same time, but being very conscious of her use of language. So I wouldn't talk about resilience, I'd talk about a strong, healthy community with healthy elders and happy kids and feeling safe and being active and being with my neighbors. And by the way, Americans don't care about health until they get sick, but they do care about happiness. And so how do we make people happier? Resilience is part of that.
Interesting way of interpreting how to communicate with the community. John.
Well, what I liked about your talk was that you're one of the few people that connect solutions to problems and action to problems. Many times we'll worry about in the academy is we're all very good at describing what's wrong with the world. How do we switch that to describe what we need to do to repair the world? And if I look at the arc of my research career, 40 years now, I think early on the mistake I made was not to engage the community, but the community itself is just a collection of individuals. You have to engage the community. I think looking at the work I've done in the last decade, you have to be able to convey your work at the individual person scale. What's in it for them? And frankly, we're all too lazy. Give you an example from my work. I'm embarrassed to say I've published a lot of papers where the description of nature was the normalized difference in vegetation index. I engage the community a lot now. I doubt I've succeeded in explaining to a single person what that means in their lives. I'm not sure I even know that either. And so my inspiration for the work I do now is not Rachel Cartman's book, although I know that well and use it in classes. There's a little book by Elder Leopold that was written a bit before that called Santa County Almanac and Sketches Here and There, because it tells you about the rhythms of nature and the joy they can bring you and what they mean in different seasons of the year and so forth. And when I'm not so positive about the world, I often go back to read a chapter just to reinvent myself and put myself back on the right track. So a lot of important work has been done that the speaker today did a great job of describing. But if we want to do meaningful and earth-changing interdisciplinary research, we have to be working at scale and with language and outcomes that people find value in.
What a treat. So here's the takeaway. I don't know if I said it adequately. Good solutions solve multiple problems. And we are very good in the academic world to solve one problem at a time and often creating another set of problems because we didn't look at the whole network. Elder Leopold would have understood that perfectly. So thinking about the web, and you use the word, I did a lot of work around syndemics, and one of your papers had the word syndemic, the epidemics will occurring, and you really have to look at it. This is where I'm going with the public health. All of health people need to be involved with environmental impact assessments. I'm telling you, they're going to be talking about spending billions of dollars on CO2 extraction from the atmosphere. And it's going to take a huge amount of energy, and I'm not sure it would do anywhere near as much good as really thinking about other ways. And I don't have the answers on this, but to only look at the engineering and economic side and not looking at what really works for people is a mistake. And we want to be looking at the impact on health. And nobody wants another environmental impact assessment, but they really want to know, how do we make everybody better, particularly the most vulnerable members of our population? Very quickly, I recently did an article in Pediatric Research, and it was a commentary with a long article on what all the doctors knew about climate change. And my article commentary was, learning is good, doing is better. And so I had a prescription. One is physicians need to exemplify. Kids don't learn from what adults say, they learn from what adults do. Two is, you got to get that carbon, you've got the right posters in the office. I want to say this, every university in the country, medical center, needs to have 2 or 3 physicians or health leaders who are knowledgeable about climate change, because the corporations, the big corporations in many places, if you're not at the table with articulate people that can have some muscle, it's not going to change it. And Howie remembers when we were in Ann Arbor, it was the pediatric residents that got them to build the Green Hospital, the Children's Hospital. It wasn't the CEO and the corporate people. So I love what you just said. It's what a pleasure to meet you all, by the way.
Thanks. Okay, Erica, please.
I want to say thank you, Dr. Jackson, for a really great talk that spanned a lot of topics and in time. One of the things that you mentioned a lot was kind of this viewpoint of like I think like an ecological model where you have multiple layers that these things are operating in and health is operating in. And for example, for my work, we're looking at the transition to electric vehicles and its impact on health. We talked a little bit this morning about this. And so you can imagine there are things that are closer to an individual's choice where they have, you know, an opportunity to make, depending on our country, the ability to make a choice. And then you have things that are upstream. So one of the things with electric vehicles, they're more expensive, so there's a financial barriers to being able to purchase an electric vehicle or lease one or something that's higher. And you also have things like your living situation. If you're in a multi-unit housing situation, you can't charge in your home, that's also a big barrier. You know, there's some discussion whether, you know, how much of a debt is a choice. You also have to do. So thinking about that, and especially thinking with engaging with communities, on one level, and then policymakers on another, do you have any guidance or advice around how to kind of bridge that, not just as academics working with community and working with policymakers, but how do you make it so that communities are given the tools, data, expertise? You gave a great example about, you know, teaching nuclear physics in a week, so that communities can more directly themselves engage with policymakers and be able to advocate for the changes that they need in their own communities so they can live healthy, happy lives.
You're tough. For the last 6 years, I was at UCLA. I and Jonathan Fielding, the former state county health officer here, were agitating around the LA River. And how do we take 56 miles of concrete culvert and turn it into a place of the heart? As you all know, it runs through some of the poorest, least parked mountain parks, least access to healthy food parts of Los Angeles. And it's very hard. And there was a push to put some Safeway, for example, in there. And the community was very concerned that this was going to bring gentrification and to make the areas around certain parts of the river much more beautiful with recreation features and green features. And I don't have a solution on that one other than imposing this from the outside is not going to work. And sidebar story, but between Contra Costa County, there is a bridge that was there had to be rebuilt, and near Martinez, California, and going up into Solano County. And the community did not want all the construction and noise of that bridge. And the community was brought in to help design the bridge. They want this feature. We want to be able to walk across the bridge. We want walkways on both sides, and they need to be safe. We want it to be beautiful with the entry ramps coming into it. We want to make our town a destination rather than a place. We want to celebrate the pride of our community. And the people that worked on this really did a beautiful job. And so the entry ramps to this now have basically sculpted artwork all the way down. There are walkways on both sides that are safe, that it's a destination for people to go to. Restaurants are nearby. And by the way, some of the best windsurfing in the state is right up and down the Carquinez Strait. So, and they named the bridge after a steel worker that had worked on the bridge, the old bridge 30 years ago or 40 years ago, and the new bridge, and that's the name of it now. But the community's wisdom and its acceptance was much greater when they were brought into the decision process. I'm going to say humbly though, I don't have the patience to do 40 community meetings, and there are people that are very good at this, and they're not extraneous. There are people you have to bring on and really pull it out, because you can show up for the last 10 minutes of the meeting and be told what they learned, but you can't go to 40 of these 2-hour meetings and listen to everything that's going on. And so I think there are practical management issues that you can do. I don't know the solution around. Pete Buttigieg kind of became a friend. I spent several days in South Bend, Indiana. He did a beautiful job turning the streets in South Bend away from one-way streets all along, and no retail on the first floor, and no quality habitation for poor people in the taller high rises, and made South Bend, Indiana. By the way, they put a kayaking to the St. Joe's River and made it a kayaking river, so it's now a destination. And people have a lot more joy and fun with that as well. And to have, I think, the smartest man in the US government, people who judge as head of transportation, is a tremendous opportunity for us all. But his vision was, let's make it good for everybody, and businesses did just fine with everything he did. I probably didn't answer it correctly, but I don't know what to do about people who live in a high rise and need to plug in their cars. Why don't you talk about, I didn't talk about the super blocks and the shorter buildings and how they're energy efficient and with a central square for people to congregate in. And I wonder, would Bob be interested in speaking to that? I don't need it.
While this conversation continues, folks who want to pose questions, raise your hand, and I'll be also looking at the chat. And I see Ricky Blumenthal weighed in and praised you for a great talk. He's one of our great community-based researchers.
Thank you. So what you've managed to do is summarize the expertise of the three of us into one solution. So we had talked earlier about the opportunity to create what I call mid-rise construction. So 4 to 5 stories and a community built out of buildings at that level, which allows you to have multiple areas of growth. It supports an ecosystem, which I'm sure John can talk more about. It supports social structure in terms of social interaction within those ecosystems as well, and then also supports services. So an economic perspective in terms of being able to provide people with services, typically on the first story of a building or ground level, and then having residential spaces above that. And so what it also provides is access to things like daylight, natural ventilation strategies. And so there's all of these co-benefits that come around looking at it from a multiple sort of perspective in terms of our built environment.
Can I just jump in with this one? I'm being annoying, but we were talking earlier about people being very nervous about using public transportation. And I lived in New York area during the 60s and early 70s, and people didn't want to get on the subway. They were afraid to do it. And what changed it most was putting, honest to God, normal working people that just wanted to go out their business. And when suddenly 90%, 95% of the people on that subway car were people that you kind of almost want to have a neighbor as a friend rather than trouble, things really got better. And by the way, they had to change the physical environment. They had to get rid of the graffiti and clean them up. And they, of course, had to do policing. There had to be on place. But, and so the density, Americans say they hate density, but in fact, quality density is exactly, and you can't support a business without quality density. You can't support transit. Nobody wants, you know, I lived at UCLA for 6-7 years without driving a car. Sometimes I had to rent one, but in general, I always used public transportation. I learned a lot about the city in that process. But it was, I really liked it when they covered the bus shelters, so I wasn't standing in the sun. I really liked it when they had the countdown timer that told me how long I could wait. So I might duck into a delicatessen, it's gonna be 10 minutes. By the way, they always come free at a time, you've noticed that, the buses. But, you know, you really do need density. And oh, by the way, you can't have a city without a subway. And I am so happy, we did a health impact assessment on the subway going, Beverly Hills didn't want a subway through because it would make noise under their fancy high school. And the health impact assessment, and they said they're right, they smoke and noise and it'll be annoying. But once the subway's in place for 100 years, people are going to be, oh, I'm so glad this is here. I get down so much more rapidly. So quality density, quality movement, safe movement, the joke I use is 100 years ago, you could take the red line from where UCLA is downtown, it would take an hour. And today you can take a Lamborghini and do the same distance and it will take an hour. Without the subway.
Any questions from the audience? Some other comments from our panelists? John?
So the way that I do community research is that, example, the Urban Trees Initiative that I lead. I don't know, the payroll is spread across 3 academic departments or schools, but I imagine that for the last 3 years, it's somewhere between 20 and 35 people on a continuous basis, and they all have different roles and responsibilities. My goal is to empower people and lead by example. So I currently have, within the part of it that I lead by myself, there are 3 undergraduates that are first authors for papers that we have to publish in journals. The other thing, looking a bit longer term, I'm the lead ideas man here and creating an interdisciplinary PhD program, Population Health in Place. You know, I was invited to a meeting sponsored by the UN and the World Health Organization in Geneva. They invited me to talk about the Urban Trees Initiative and what it means. But the takeaway is I'm now engaged with both organizations in the University of Geneva about making a consortium of, around the world, including the Global South, that would focus on the intersection of the social sciences and public health sciences, which is essentially what Population Health Place does here at this university.
Let me ask John a question. John, hospitals, nonprofit. By the way, I'm very cynical about nonprofit hospitals because I think a lot of them are more for-profit than the for-profit hospitals, but that's another discussion. But there's nonprofits are supposed to have it set aside for community improvement. And have you been able to use any of those funds and support for your trees initiative? Because, I mean, planting tree in Richmond, California, the California Endowment funded the planting of trees in Richmond. They actually hired gang members to do it. So they began to have pride about that tree. The people who lived in that house were charged, you gotta water that tree and make sure it lays. But it's like a good solution solving, you know, creates many benefits, not just one. But I love the tree story. And I think it was Des Moines or South Sioux Falls had a derecho. This is this line storm that goes through and knocked out 100,000 trees. And one issue was they turned out in America, we always plant a whole lot of the same thing, and it's not a good idea. You have Mother Nature loves diversity. And 2, could you just talk a little more? I think the tree initiative is brilliant.
Well, I do work with hospitals, with the Keck system. We know now how to enrich electronic health records with social and environmental determinants of health. We have longitudinal data, in some cases that goes back 20 years, that are attached to records with different addresses that people had at different times. And we can now do this at scale, meaning we can update 20 million health records quarterly with different kinds of data. And that's normally now maybe a 2-day exercise on my side and a 2-day exercise on the medical side. I have 2 permanent staff in my research group, and 1 is permanently assigned to Children's Hospital Los Angeles. He works with a group of faculty there, and we support a lot of spatial initiatives there, as well as including a study that one of the PhD students in a degree program I told you, where we looked at what kinds of patients are late for elective surgery and where do they live and in what kinds of communities do they live. Because you set up surgery for a day, apparently it costs about $100 a minute. That cost is driven up if there's no shows or late shows. And so there are practical things to do here. I think I'm about to do the same thing for the Keck system as well. But back to trees, we haven't needed or thought of acquiring those kinds of funds. The early part of the work was funded by foundations. The next part was funded by some litigation funds that the university was awarded, and that's still ongoing. And then I have a big grant with Manuel Pastor from the Space Officers Fund.
It's a quick question. The gangs issue in many cities in California, maybe in the rest of the country, I don't know about that, has really been a big one. And I will confess that I love the work that Father Greg Boyle has done, tattoos on the heart and other such things. And it'd be lovely to figure out a way to take some of that to scale, because I believe that some of the things he's doing are models of community resilience, and to take that, those are strong young people with really could contribute a lot. We've not done enough to harbor that power. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking about as I've been hearing this conversation and what people have mentioned is the idea of benefits and co-benefits with a lot of these different, might initially be health focused or economic focused activities and the co-benefits that come along with it. And oftentimes with going back to the, climate change or, climate heating, often it's this, if you talk really about, apathy and panic, two ends there with reactions and, there's both apathy and, potential panic for climate change, but the framing of climate change and a reaction to it being the greatest public health opportunity of our time, I think is key. And not just public health, but I guess how you define public health, but more broadly societal benefits. For example, people who were previously gang members having a different potential path in life that they can benefit from because of activities that are ongoing in their community. And I think that framing of it, that lens of it is very motivating as opposed to a more panic-based, scary-based motivation around climate change and climate change action.
I don't use the term, I try not to use the term public health. What? The average American, when they hear the term public health, thinks about sitting in an STD clinic on a plastic chair with ugly fluorescent lights over their head, scared to death. And so really talking about happiness and well-being and resilience and vigor and energy is a much, I think, more energetic message. I want a big one. And I had a tough time preparing this talk. It looks simple, but trying to leave stuff out, and I didn't even do a good job of that. But my friend Ed Maybach, who's thought a lot about communicate. This guy's great. Communication around climate says it's worth writing in. Numbers numb, stories stick. And so when I was meeting with my colleagues, I said, "Tell me a story." People don't forget stories if they're good ones. But you'll remember the data that people got better when the air pollution went down. But that's about all they're going to remember. They're not going to remember the numbers. I barely can. So think about how you convert what you're doing into a story that you could tell over a dinner table to strangers, and they go, "Oh, that's really cool. I love that."
But Boyle Heights is just across the freeway. The story there would be that 1 in 5 households have no car. 60–70% of the residents are rented. Average length of the average length of time households have lived there is in many cases greater than 10 years. So if I was walking the neighbourhood and I met a child, school children with a caregiver, and they were maybe 7 to 10 years old, when I was busy going out for the day, and all my mother told me was to come home before the street lights get turned on. I'd go to a big nature reserve with a couple of buddies. One buddy took home some ducks once, that wasn't very wise. Generally, I was in no trouble. But the assumption that a child in Boyle Heights has been to the ocean once, or been to a national forest or a park once, probably not, right? And so you have to meet people in the middle to have any chance of persuading them that something else in their life matters than what they're already concerned about, and then there might be something better than they've experienced.
A very, very common reaction to that is, I think that also very much highlights the importance of having diversity in researchers, because there are probably people who experience that kind of childhood growing up, and having that perspective is really helpful in these conversations.
So I'm the last person the community wants to talk to in my group. Undergraduates, fantastic.
And so what this is really speaking to is empowering the individual to recognize the opportunities that they have to contribute to making change. We're really seeing that within our own university and our own health system as we incorporate sustainability into everything that we do. And it's something that I learned out doing field work in my other sort of life, where I do research on construction materials that are forest-based, specifically bamboo. And a memory I have is just really seeing the community member that had been taught how to manage a forest and to bring that forest to life felt this sense of stewardship, the sense of responsibility, as well as so much pride. And so that's really something that sticks with me in terms of being able to meet people on the individual level and give them the tools as well as to listen to their ideas so that we can turn those into opportunities.
Very quickly. Did you see that President Biden has, and I think the Vice President made the announcement around a climate action corps? It'll be similar to the so-called CCC that was put in place during the Depression. When I was growing up, I knew then men who had been very poor during the Depression as, 18-year-olds and gone off to work on the Civilian Conservation Corps. Many of them described it as the happiest times in their life. And the folks that worked in the California Conservation Corps, many of them had never seen a forest, had never built a trail or stair steps. And I'm just thrilled that President Biden is going to afford on this. If he's reelected, I would hope that they would expand this sidebar, but I'm going to confess this. And I'm probably going to be unpopular. I think every American, male and female, at age 18 or 19, ought to be required to do some kind of service. You can work in a school, you can work in a hospital, you can work in the woods. If you want to carry a gun, you can join the military. But we have sort of lost the fact that the world is bigger and you can influence, bigger than you will ever know growing up. And you can influence that positively and you can feel good about your influence going forward. And we changed seatbelts, we changed tobacco by focusing on the young. It took a generation to do it, but it really did work. So focusing on the young and not taking away their joy and their sense of empowerment and not scaring them in the process. You can do this, and there's going to be plenty of money around for adaptation to climate, and that's going to be the big thing going forward is adaptation. And you got to make sure it's done fairly and it's done well. It adds to people's well-being and happiness.
On that note, I would say I was in the National Health Service Corps. They paid for my medical education. I spent the next 45 years paying back. So I want to thank Bob, John, and Garrigan, and of course our guest speaker, Keck, did a fabulous job of connecting with us and also our communities with the work that we do. I wouldn't say he showed 57 slides, but he told a good yarn. So thank everybody for coming to this grand round, and we'll see you next time.